The carriage jolted hard, and Charlotte grabbed the wooden frame beside her as the horses screamed into the night. Outside, something moved between the trees, fast and silent, brushing past the torchlight before vanishing again. The driver shouted for the horses to hold steady, but they would not listen. Charlotte pressed herself against the seat, her breath quick, her hands cold. Captain Edward rode alongside the carriage, sword drawn, his eyes scanning the black tree line. He had led Charlotte's guard for 6 years, through border disputes and mountain storms, but she had never seen him this tense. He kept glancing at the trees as though he expected them to open and swallow the road whole. "Stay low," he called to her. "Do not look outside." She did not listen. She leaned toward the small window and looked out at the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing but trees and shifting fog. Then, between 2 old oaks, she saw a shape. It was tall, thin, and wrong, in a way she could not explain. It did not walk. It simply appeared closer each time she blinked. The horses reared again, and the carriage tilted sharply before slamming back down. Charlotte heard one of the guards cry out, not in pain, but in fear, the kind of fear that comes from seeing something the mind refuses to accept. Then, as quickly as it began, the shape was gone. The trees stood still. The fog settled. The horses calmed, panting, their sides slick with sweat. Edward rode up beside the carriage window, his face pale under the torchlight. "We are close now," he said. "Do not stop the carriage again until we reach the manor gates." Charlotte nodded, though her heart still pounded. She was the eldest daughter of King Alden, ruler of Vaith, and she had grown up hearing about war, about famine, about the slow bleeding of a kingdom caught between 2 hungry neighbors. She had not grown up hearing about creatures that moved like smoke through the trees. The marriage had been her father's idea, though it was really the idea of every advisor and general who had grown tired of watching Vaith's people suffer between the armies of Draymore and Ashcross. Neither kingdom would accept peace on the other's terms. But there was a third option, one that no one had considered until a stranger's name began appearing in old letters passed between diplomats. For 3 years, border skirmishes had drained Vaith's treasury and its young soldiers in equal measure, each side blaming the other for raids that left farms burned and families displaced. King Alden had tried marriage alliances before, offering Charlotte's hand to lesser nobles from both rival kingdoms, hoping to bind the conflict through family ties rather than treaties easily broken. Each attempt collapsed under the weight of old grudges neither side could set aside. Draymore's court considered Ashcross beneath them. Ashcross remembered too clearly the losses Draymore's armies had inflicted a generation earlier. Neither would accept the other as an equal partner in peace. A marriage to someone outside both rivalries offered something neither kingdom could dismiss as favoritism toward the other. If Charlotte married a man claimed by no kingdom at all, neither Draymore nor Ashcross could accuse Vaith of choosing sides. It was, on paper, an elegant solution to a problem that had resisted every other attempt at resolution. Only the whispered fear surrounding the stranger's valley had kept any previous king from considering it seriously. His name was Daniel. No one in Vaith knew where he came from, not truly. Some said he arrived from a place beyond the known world, a realm people whispered about only as the far side of the veil. Others said he had simply always been there, hidden at the edge of the map, waiting. What everyone agreed on was this: no kingdom would send its soldiers past the old stone markers that surrounded his land. No merchant would trade with his village. No mapmaker would draw the roads leading to his door. And yet, when King Alden proposed a marriage between his daughter and this stranger, as a symbol of neutral ground between 3 warring kingdoms, Daniel had agreed without hesitation. It was that simple agreement, arriving faster than expected, that had unsettled Charlotte the most. The carriage rolled through an open iron gate and up a long stone path lined with quiet, leafless trees. The manor ahead was large but plain, built of gray stone with narrow windows and a single lit lantern by the door. It did not look like the home of someone every kingdom feared. It looked like the home of someone who wanted to be forgotten. Edward helped her down from the carriage, his hand firm on her arm. "Stay close to me until we are inside," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "Edward, what is out there?" He did not answer right away. He looked past her, toward the tree line one last time, then shook his head. I do not know. None of us do. That is what frightens people most. The manor door opened before they reached it, and a woman stepped out to greet them, holding a lantern. She introduced herself as Grace, a servant of the house, and welcomed Charlotte with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She led them into a warm hall, lit by candles, away from the cold and the silence of the road. It was there that Charlotte first saw him. Daniel stood near the far end of the hall, dressed simply, without the jewels or ceremonial robes she expected from a man about to marry a princess. He was tall, calm, and unreadable, watching her approach with an expression that held no fear, no excitement, only quiet patience. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "You must be tired from the road," he said. "I am sorry for what happened out there. It will not happen again tonight." Charlotte studied him carefully. "You know what that was?" "I have an idea," he said simply, and offered nothing more. She wanted to press him further, but something about the stillness in his eyes told her this was not the moment. Before Grace could lead her away, Charlotte glanced once more around the hall, noticing how few servants moved through it, compared to the grand houses she had visited in her own kingdom. A single fire burned in the hearth, tended but modest, and the furniture, though well kept, showed the plain, practical style of a household that valued quiet over show. "You keep a small staff for a man about to marry a princess," she observed. Daniel allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "Fewer people means fewer questions asked, and fewer questions asked means fewer answers I must find a way to avoid giving. I understand that may seem unwelcoming to someone raised in a court full of servants and ceremony." "It seems careful," Charlotte said. "Not unwelcoming, careful." Something shifted subtly in his expression at her choice of word, as though she had noticed something he rarely expected outsiders to see so quickly. "You are perceptive," he said. "That may serve you well here, or it may only bring you closer to truths you would be safer not knowing." "I did not travel this far to remain safely ignorant," she replied. Daniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his calm eyes, before he inclined his head slightly, a small gesture of respect rather than agreement. "Then perhaps you and I will understand each other better than either of us expected." Grace guided her toward the guest chambers, promising warm food and rest, and Charlotte allowed herself to be led away, though her mind kept circling back to the shape in the trees, and the calm, careful way Daniel had answered her question, without truly answering it at all. That night, unable to sleep, she opened the shutters of her window and looked out over the quiet grounds. The manor sat surrounded by dark fields, and beyond them, a small village slept in silence. No lights burned there, no sound reached her window, not even the bark of a dog or the call of a night bird. It was as if the entire land held its breath, waiting for something to pass. She noticed an old woman standing at the edge of the property, near the tree line, watching the manor. Charlotte could not see her face clearly in the dark, but she felt the woman's eyes on her window. When Charlotte lifted a hand, meaning to call out, the old woman turned and walked into the trees without a word. The next morning, Charlotte asked Grace about the woman, describing her as best she could. Grace's expression tightened, just for a moment, before she smoothed it into practiced calm. "That would be Agnes," Grace said. "She lives at the edge of the old village. She does not often come this close to the manor." "Why not?" Grace busied herself with folding linens, avoiding the question the way everyone in this house seemed to avoid questions. "She has her reasons, my lady. Best not to trouble yourself with village talk." Charlotte let the matter rest, though she did not forget it. Over the following days, she noticed a pattern taking shape around her. Servants lowered their voices whenever Daniel's name came up in conversation with outsiders. Guards from her own kingdom, men who had ridden beside her for years, grew quiet and watchful the moment the sun began to set. Even Edward, usually so certain and steady, checked the locks on the manor doors twice each night, before allowing himself to rest. No one spoke openly about what waited beyond the old stone markers. No one explained why every kingdom, no matter how desperate for allies, refused to send soldiers onto Daniel's land. Charlotte began to understand that the silence itself was the answer, though it told her nothing of what the danger actually was. On the fourth evening, while walking the halls unable to sleep, she passed an open door leading to a small study she had not noticed before. Old maps covered the walls, marked with strange symbols she did not recognize, circles drawn around certain villages with dates written beside them. One name caught her eye immediately: Ashvale. It was circled in dark ink, with a single word written beside it that made her stomach turn cold: silent. She did not know what it meant, not yet, but she knew enough to understand that whatever answer waited for her in this house would not come easily. Whatever Daniel truly was, whatever followed him through the dark, it had already claimed a place called Ashvale, and every kingdom in the land had chosen fear over questions ever since. Charlotte closed the study door quietly and returned to her chambers, but sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake listening to the wind moving through the empty fields outside, wondering how many other rooms in this quiet, careful house held secrets that no one dared speak aloud, and how long she had before she would need answers she was not sure she was ready to hear. Morning brought no comfort. Charlotte woke to find the manor unusually still, the kind of silence that felt deliberate rather than peaceful. She dressed quickly and made her way to the dining hall, where she found Edward standing near the window, arms crossed, watching the fields with a look she had not seen on him before. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of a soldier bracing for something he could not fight with a sword. "Something happened last night," she said, joining him at the window. Edward did not turn to face her immediately. "One of the eastern fields lost its entire crop overnight. Grain that was healthy yesterday is gray and dead this morning. No frost. No sickness we can explain." Charlotte followed his gaze toward the field in question. Even from a distance, she could see the difference, the way the color had drained from the land in a wide, unnatural circle. She thought of the shape in the trees on the night she arrived, the silence surrounding Ashvale on the old map, the word written beside its name. Whatever waited beyond the stone markers was not sleeping, it was watching, and it was growing closer. Charlotte spent the following days walking the manor grounds, searching for answers no one seemed willing to give her directly. She began with small questions, asked casually over meals, or during quiet walks with Grace through the garden. She learned that the manor had stood on this land for generations, long before Daniel arrived, though none of the servants could say exactly when he had come to live there, or where he had been before. "He simply appeared one spring," Grace told her one afternoon, pulling weeds from a bed of pale flowers. "The old owners had passed, the house was empty, and then it was not. People said a stranger had moved in overnight, though no one saw him arrive. Within a year, kingdoms stopped sending patrols anywhere near this valley." "Why would a single man frighten 3 kingdoms into silence?" Charlotte asked. Grace did not answer right away. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the tree line, the same tree line Charlotte had watched from her window that first night. "It was never about the man, my lady. It was about what came with him." That was as much as Grace would say, no matter how gently Charlotte pressed. It seemed the servants of the house had learned long ago that certain questions brought only trouble, and they had chosen comfort over curiosity. Later that same day, Charlotte sought out an older groundskeeper named Oliver, who tended the stables and had served the manor even longer than Grace. She found him repairing a fence post near the eastern paddock, his hands rough and steady despite his age. When she asked him about the years before Daniel's arrival, he set down his tools and studied her carefully, as though weighing whether she truly wanted the answer. "I remember the valley before he came," Oliver said finally. "Quiet fields, ordinary neighbors, nothing worth writing into any book. Then one spring, everything changed, though not all at once. It was small things first. A dog that would not stop howling at nothing. A well that ran strange for a week before settling again. We told ourselves it was simply a hard season. When did people realize it was something more?" "When Ashvale went silent," Oliver said, his voice dropping lower. "Word reached us within days. Soldiers rode through asking every household the same questions, over and over, as though repetition might change the answer. None of us had seen anything unusual near our own homes. Not yet. It took time before we understood the danger was not confined to one village. It simply had not reached us yet." "Were you afraid, living so close to the manor?" Oliver considered the question honestly. "For years, yes. Then I watched the stranger keep to himself, season after season, never causing harm, never inviting trouble beyond what already followed him. Fear settles differently, Once you have lived beside something long enough without incident, it becomes more like caution than terror. Charlotte thanked him and continued her walk through the grounds, turning his words over in her mind. It struck her that everyone she spoke with described the same pattern: sudden dread, followed by a long, careful adjustment, fear worn down slowly into wary tolerance. No one, in all her conversations, had ever described feeling safe, only accustomed. That evening, she asked Grace to bring any remaining household records from the years surrounding Ashvale's disappearance, hoping for something more precise than memory alone could offer. Grace hesitated, then agreed, returning later with a small bundle of letters tied together with fraying string, correspondence between the manor's previous caretaker and officials from all three kingdoms. Most of the letters were formal and cautious, requesting updates, offering little information in return. But one letter, written by an official from Ashcross, contained a passage that caught Charlotte's attention immediately. It described an expedition sent to study the empty village, using scholars rather than soldiers, hoping knowledge might succeed where swords had failed. The letter ended abruptly, the final line noting only that the expedition had not returned as scheduled, and no further attempt would be authorized afterward. Charlotte set the letter down slowly, understanding now why the old study upstairs held maps and symbols rather than answers. Even those who had approached the mystery with curiosity rather than violence had lost people to it. Whatever waited beyond the stone markers had learned, over time, to punish every kind of attention equally, whether it arrived as an army or as a question. Charlotte's next attempt led her back to the small study she had discovered on her first week in the manor. This time, she searched more carefully, pulling old journals from the shelves and reading by candlelight late into the evening. Most were dry records of harvests and household accounts, unremarkable and dull. But tucked behind a row of ledgers, she found a thinner book, its leather cover worn soft with age, containing handwriting far more hurried than the rest. The entries were dated many years earlier, written by someone who never signed their name. The early pages described ordinary village life in a town called Ashvale, a farming community 2 days' ride from the manor. The author wrote of good harvests, a new well being dug, a wedding celebrated with music that lasted 3 nights. Then, abruptly, the tone changed. One entry, dated only by season, read simply, "The stranger came through our fields last night. Nothing followed the crops today. The animals will not leave their pens." The next few pages grew shorter, more fragmented, as though the author had less time or less courage to write at length. Sounds in the night that no one could explain. Livestock found wandering far from home, confused, as though they had forgotten their own barns. A well that ran dry overnight, then filled again the next morning as though nothing had happened. The final entry in the journal was only a few lines long. Charlotte had to angle the candle closer to read the shaking handwriting. "Everyone is leaving before nightfall. The elders say to go now, go far, and do not look behind us on the road. I do not understand what we are running from, only that we must run." There were no entries after that. The rest of the journal's pages were blank. Charlotte sat with the book in her lap for a long time, turning the empty pages, searching for something more that simply was not there. She thought of the map in this very room, the circled village named Ashvale, the single cold word written beside it: silent. Whatever had happened to that town, it had not ended in fire or in battle. There were no accounts of soldiers, no records of siege or slaughter. The people of Ashvale had simply left, driven away by something they could not name, something that had first appeared the same way the stranger in this manor had first appeared, without warning, without explanation, arriving from nowhere and changing everything after. She returned the journal to its hiding place and resolved to speak with Captain Edward the following morning, hoping his years of service might have taught him more than the frightened servants were willing to share. She found him at dawn, checking the perimeter fence along the eastern field, the same field that had lost its crop days earlier. The gray patch of dead grain had not recovered. If anything, it seemed to have spread slightly wider overnight, creeping toward the fence line like a slow stain. "You have served my father a long time," Charlotte said, joining him at the fence. "Longer than most. You must have heard something of what happened here, before the marriage was arranged." Edward kept his eyes on the field. "I have heard rumors, my lady. the same as any soldier hears rumors passed between watchposts. Most of it I dismissed as superstition, until I saw that field with my own eyes 3 nights ago. What rumors? He hesitated, and for a moment, Charlotte thought he might refuse to answer at all, the same way everyone else in this house had refused. But something in her expression must have convinced him otherwise, because he finally spoke, his voice low. They say the stranger did not come to this world by choice. They say something followed him through, something that does not belong here, any more than he does. The old soldiers who patrolled this border years ago called it the Hollow, though none of them could describe it clearly. Some said it took the shape of shadow. Others said it took the shape of sound, a kind of humming that grows louder the closer it comes. Charlotte felt a chill despite the morning sun. And Ashvale? Edward's jaw tightened. The first place it appeared, before anyone understood what they were dealing with. The kingdom sent soldiers to investigate the empty village. Most came back with nothing to report, but empty homes and untouched belongings, as though the people had simply walked away mid-meal and never returned. A few soldiers went missing entirely. After that, no kingdom sent anyone near this valley again. They built the stone markers instead, and agreed among themselves, without ever saying it aloud, to leave the stranger and whatever followed him well enough alone. And now my father has arranged a marriage that will draw attention right back to this valley. Edward met her eyes for the first time since she had approached him. Yes, my lady, that is exactly what worries me. Charlotte looked back toward the manor, toward the quiet stone walls that held Daniel's careful silence and Grace's practiced smiles, and toward the dead field stretching wider each night. She understood now why every kingdom had chosen fear over questions. But she was not every kingdom. She had come here to prevent a war, and she would not leave without understanding exactly what price that peace might carry. That evening, she waited until the manor had grown quiet, until Grace had retired and the guards had taken their posts along the outer walls, before she made her way toward Daniel's private study. She found him there, seated near a low fire, a single candle burning beside a stack of old letters. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised, as though he had expected her sooner. "You found the journal," he said, before she could speak. Charlotte stopped in the doorway. "How did you know?" "Because everyone who stays here long enough finds it eventually." He set the letters aside and gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, if you wish. I imagine you have questions I have been avoiding since the day you arrived." She sat, though she kept her back straight, unwilling to relax fully in his presence, until she understood him better. "Captain Edward told me what the soldiers called it, the Hollow." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a flicker of old exhaustion beneath his calm exterior. "That is one name for it, yes. Is it true? Did something follow you here?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire, as though gathering the strength to answer a question he had clearly answered before, to other people, in other rooms, long before Charlotte had ever arrived. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with the weight of years. "Yes," he said simply. "Something did follow me. It has followed me since the night I first crossed into this world, and it will keep following me until I find a way to end what was started that night." Ashvale was not an accident, Charlotte. It was a warning, one I did not understand quickly enough to prevent. Outside, far beyond the manor walls, a low sound began to rise from the tree line, faint at first, like a voice hidden just beneath the wind. Charlotte felt the hair rise on her arms. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to something only he could fully hear, then looked back at her with quiet resolve. "It knows you are asking questions," he said, "and now, so does it." Charlotte did not move from her chair, unwilling to let the moment pass without pressing further. "Tell me about the life you lost. Not the bargain, not the presents. You, before any of this happened." Daniel seemed surprised by the question, as though no one had asked him something so simple in a very long time. "I had a family," he said slowly. "A mother who worried too much, a younger sister who never stopped talking. I worked with my hands, building things, ordinary things, furniture, and small repairs for neighbors. It was not an extraordinary life, but it was mine, and I never once imagined losing it. Do you believe they still search for you?" I do not know if any time passes at all where they are, or if the world I left continues exactly as I remember it, frozen the moment I disappeared. His voice grew quieter. That uncertainty has been its own kind of grief, Charlotte, separate from anything the presence demands of me. I do not know if I am mourned, forgotten, or simply erased from memory, the way Ashvale's people may have been erased from this one. Is that why you never tried to leave this valley, even after the years passed and the fear settled into something calmer? Partly, he admitted. I told myself I stayed to protect others from what follows me. That much is true. But I also stayed because leaving would mean accepting that the life I lost is truly gone, and some part of me was never ready to accept that fully. He looked at her directly, something raw beneath his usual composure. Meeting you has made me realize how long I have been standing still, waiting for a loss to finish happening, rather than living with what remains. Charlotte considered his words carefully, before speaking again. Perhaps the presence is not the only thing that needs releasing tonight. Daniel did not answer immediately, but something in his expression shifted, the beginning of an understanding he had clearly avoided examining too closely for a very long time. Daniel rose from his chair and moved to the window, drawing the curtain back just enough to look out at the dark fields beyond. The low sound continued, steady and distant, neither growing closer nor fading away, as though it were simply reminding them both that it was listening. "Tell me everything," Charlotte said. "Not fragments, not warnings passed through soldiers and journals. I need to understand what I have agreed to be part of." Daniel let the curtain fall and returned to his seat, folding his hands together as he searched for where to begin. "I did not come to this world through choice, or through magic anyone here would recognize. Where I come from, there is no veil, no kingdoms like yours, no creatures like the one you heard tonight. I lived an ordinary life, until one evening, the world simply opened beneath my feet and pulled me through into a place between worlds, a gray, empty space that should not exist. What was there? Nothing, at first, only silence, and a kind of pressure, as though the space itself did not want me there. Then something approached me in the dark, something that had no shape I could describe, only a presence, patient and old, the way a mountain might feel patient if a mountain could think. It did not speak in words. It offered something closer to understanding, pressed directly into my mind. It told me it could return me to solid ground, to a living world, but only if I agreed to carry it with me. Charlotte leaned forward slightly. "And you agreed." "I was drowning in a place with no air, and no light, Charlotte. I would have agreed to anything." Daniel's voice remained level, but she could hear the old regret beneath it, worn smooth by years of repeating this same confession to himself in quiet moments. "It brought me here, to this valley, and it kept its side of the bargain. It gave me solid ground beneath my feet and air to breathe. But it never explained the rest of the exchange. Not fully. Not until Ashvale. What happened there? I did not understand at first that the presence needed to test its boundaries in this world, the way any traveler tests the strength of new ground before trusting it fully. It chose the nearest village to do so. I did not know it had happened until soldiers arrived at my door demanding answers I did not have. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the fire, though his focus seemed far away, back in that first terrible season. The people were gone, Charlotte, not harmed. Not killed, as far as any soldier could determine, simply gone, as though the presence had folded them into that same gray space between worlds where it had once held me. Charlotte felt her stomach twist. They are still there? In that space? I do not know. I have spent years searching for a way to know, and I have found nothing. That is the truth I have carried since that first season, the truth every kingdom eventually learned and chose to bury rather than face directly. They tried, at first, to end the threat the way soldiers end most threats. Swords accomplished nothing against something with no body to strike. Fire found nothing to burn. Every attempt only seemed to draw the presence closer to whoever tried hardest to destroy it, as though violence itself fed whatever hunger it carried. So they stopped trying. They built the stone markers instead, and they agreed, kingdom by kingdom, to leave this valley alone. I chose to remain here, rather than wander into new lands and risk drawing the presence toward people who had never learned to fear it. I have spent years alone specifically so that no one else would be close enough to lose. He finally looked at her directly, his expression unguarded for the first time since she had arrived. Your father's proposal was the first offer in a very long time that did not ask me to disappear entirely from the world. I should have refused it. I told myself I was strong enough to protect you from what I carry. I am no longer certain that was true. The low sound outside rose slightly, then faded again, as though testing the edges of the conversation happening inside the manor walls. Charlotte sat with everything he had told her, turning it over slowly, searching for the fear she expected to feel, and finding, instead, something closer to determination.
You said it tests boundaries,
She said. Is that what is happening now? The dead crops? The shape in the trees the night I arrived? Yes, it has been quiet for years, content with the small, careful world I built for it here. But a marriage between kingdoms draws attention, Charlotte. Soldiers, diplomats, letters passing between courts that have avoided this valley for a generation. The presence senses that attention returning, and it is beginning to stir the way it stirred before Ashvale, testing whether this new attention means the world is finally ready to notice it again. Then we stop the attention, Charlotte said. We call off the marriage, quietly, before it grows any closer to whatever happened before. Daniel shook his head slowly. It is not that simple anymore. The moment it senses fear retreating, it senses weakness, an opportunity to press further, rather than settle back into stillness. Ending the marriage now would not calm it. It would embolden it, the same way backing away from a wild animal invites it to follow. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. There may be another path, one I have searched for since the day Ashvale disappeared, though I have never found the strength or the knowledge to attempt it alone. What path? The exchange that brought me here was never completed fully. The presence gave me solid ground, but it never received whatever payment it expected in return. Not truly. I believe that incompleteness is why it still lingers, still tests boundaries, still hungers for something it has not yet received. If that exchange could be finished properly, resolved on terms that do not require another village, another Ashvale, I believe it would finally have no reason to remain bound to this world at all. How would you finish it? I do not know yet. The knowledge I would need existed once, in old texts kept by scholars who studied the Veil long before soldiers and stone markers replaced curiosity with fear. Most of those texts were lost or destroyed generations ago, considered too dangerous to preserve. If any copies remain, they would be hidden in places few people still remember, guarded by those who inherited fear rather than understanding. Charlotte thought of the old woman she had seen at the edge of the tree line her first night in the valley, watching the manor with quiet, knowing eyes, before disappearing silently into the dark. Agnes, she said. The village elder Grace mentioned. She lives near the old village boundary, and has avoided the manor for years. Perhaps she remembers more than anyone here realizes. Daniel considered this. It is possible. The oldest families in this valley predate even my arrival. If any knowledge survived the scholar's fall, it may have found its way into village memory, passed down as story rather than record. Outside, the low sound finally faded into silence, as though satisfied for the moment with what it had gathered from their conversation, or perhaps simply retreating to gather strength for whatever came next. Charlotte rose from her chair, feeling the weight of everything Daniel had shared settling firmly into her resolve, rather than her fear. Tomorrow, she said, we speak with Agnes together. Daniel studied her for a long moment, something like surprise crossing his features, quickly replaced by quiet gratitude. Most people, once they learn the truth, choose to leave this valley as quickly as the roads allow. I did not come here to run from difficult truths, Charlotte said. I came here to prevent a war between three kingdoms. If ending what follows you is the only path to a peace that actually lasts, then that is the path I intend to take, alongside you rather than despite you. She left him there beside the low fire, his expression unreadable, but no longer entirely guarded, and returned to her chambers, with her mind racing through everything she had learned. Sleep did not come easily again that night, though this time it was not fear that kept her awake, but the careful, determined shape of a plan beginning to take form, one that would require courage from everyone in this quiet, careful house, herself included. The following morning arrived gray and still, the kind of stillness that felt deliberate rather than peaceful, the entire valley seeming to hold its breath alongside its residents. Charlotte dressed quickly and found Daniel already waiting near the stables, 2 horses saddled and ready, Captain Edward standing nearby with an expression that suggested he had already guessed, correctly, that this journey would not be a simple morning ride. "You should take guards," Edward said, though his tone suggested he already expected to be refused. "Agnes has avoided armed soldiers for years," Daniel said. "Approaching her with a show of force would only confirm every fear that has kept her silent this long. Charlotte and I will go alone. If we are not back by evening, then you may act as you see fit." Edward did not look pleased, but he nodded, understanding the delicate nature of what they attempted better than most soldiers might have. Charlotte mounted her horse, casting one last glance toward the eastern field, where the gray patch of dead crop had spread further still overnight, creeping steadily closer to the manor grounds like a slow, patient tide. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, following a narrow path that wound away from the manor and toward the scattered remains of the old village, homes long abandoned, their roofs sagging, their gardens overtaken by weeds. Agnes lived at the very edge of this quiet ruin, in a small cottage that somehow still stood proud, despite the decay surrounding it, smoke curling steadily from its chimney, as though she had been expecting visitors all along. She opened her door before they even reached it, standing in the frame with sharp, knowing eyes that studied Charlotte and Daniel both without a trace of surprise. "I wondered how long it would take," Agnes said, before someone finally came asking the right questions. She welcomed them inside, where the small cottage smelled of dried herbs and old parchment, shelves lined with jars and bundles Charlotte could not name. Agnes gestured for them to sit near a modest table, then settled across from them with the unhurried patience of someone who had waited a very long time to finally speak. "My grandmother lived through Ashvale's fall," Agnes said, folding her weathered hands together. She was among the few who escaped before the silence took the rest. She spent the remainder of her life gathering what she could of the old knowledge, the kind scholars once studied, before fear replaced their libraries with ash. "She taught me everything she remembered, though I have kept it hidden, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to need it." "You know how the exchange might be completed," Daniel said. It was not a question. "Before I answer that," Agnes said, "you should understand what has already failed, so you do not repeat mistakes that cost good soldiers their lives. 3 kingdoms tried 3 different approaches in the years following Ashvale, each convinced their own strength would prove sufficient, where the others had not yet tried." "What did they attempt?" Charlotte asked. "Draymore sent its finest soldiers first, believing sheer numbers and steel could overwhelm anything, no matter how strange. They surrounded the valley at night, torches lit, blades ready, expecting a creature they could see clearly enough to strike. Instead, the presence moved among them like fog moves through a forest, untouched by every blade swung in its direction. Several soldiers returned home unable to speak clearly for weeks afterward, their minds shaken by something they could not describe in any language that made sense to their commanders." "And Ashcross?" "Ashcross trusted knowledge over strength, sending scholars rather than soldiers, believing understanding might succeed where violence had failed. That expedition fared little better, though its failure taught something the soldiers' failure had not. The scholars who returned, and only half of them did, reported that the presence seemed almost curious about their questions, lingering near their camp rather than attacking outright, as though it recognized their approach as different from the armies before them. It simply never gave them what they sought, and eventually their questions went unanswered long enough that fear replaced curiosity, even among men who had traveled there specifically to overcome it. "What of Vaith?" Daniel asked quietly. "My own kingdom must have attempted something as well. Vaith tried patience," Agnes said. "Your king's grandfather ordered the valley watched rather than confronted, hoping time alone might weaken whatever haunted these fields. Decades passed, and the presence neither grew nor faded, content simply to remain, testing occasionally, retreating just as often, until eventually Vaith's court concluded that patience alone would never resolve what violence and knowledge had both failed to end." "3 approaches," Charlotte said slowly. "Force, understanding, and patience. All of them failed. Because all three mistook the presence for an enemy to be defeated, rather than a debt to be honestly repaid, Agnes said. My grandmother believed that distinction mattered more than any kingdom ever understood. You cannot defeat a bargain, you can only complete it. Agnes nodded slowly. The presence you carry crossed into this world through an old kind of bargain, older than any kingdom currently standing. Such bargains are never one-sided, no matter how they first appear. It gave you passage into life. In return, it requires something of equal weight, something given freely rather than taken by force. That is why swords and fire accomplished nothing against it. Violence takes, it does not give. What must be given? Charlotte asked. That depends on what was truly lost, the night the bargain was struck, Agnes said, looking directly at Daniel. Tell me, stranger, what did you leave behind in your own world when the ground opened beneath you? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, memories clearly surfacing that he had not touched in years. A life I did not choose to leave. People who likely still wonder what became of me. A future I never got to see unfold. Then perhaps that is your answer, Agnes said gently. The presence did not simply grant you passage from nothing. It granted you an entire new existence, a second life built from the ashes of the one you lost. Such a gift demands an equal offering, not of blood or violence, but of something equally significant freely surrendered. My grandmother believed the old bargains could only be closed by the one who made them, offering back something of true value, chosen rather than stolen. What would that mean for Daniel? Charlotte asked, dread creeping into her voice despite her effort to remain steady. Agnes met her eyes evenly. It could mean many things, child. Perhaps a memory precious beyond measure. Perhaps a hope he has carried since arriving here. The old texts were never clear on exact terms, only that the offering must matter greatly to the one giving it, and it must be given willingly, without force or trickery, for the bargain to finally close. And if the offering is refused, or if it is not enough? Daniel asked quietly. Agnes's expression grew somber. Then the presence remains bound to you, hungrier than before, having tested the boundary and found it lacking. That is a risk only you can decide whether to accept. They stayed with Agnes through the remainder of the morning, absorbing every fragment of memory and old teaching she offered, writing down what details could be captured on paper, though much of it remained frustratingly vague, shaped more by fading memory than precise instruction. By the time they finally rode back toward the manor, the sky had shifted from gray to a deeper, heavier color, storm clouds gathering along the horizon, as though the valley itself sensed the decision now weighing over it. They arrived back at the manor, to find Captain Edward waiting anxiously near the gate, his expression tight with news that could not wait. A rider came from Draymore while you were away, Edward said. Prince Julian is on his way here, along with a small escort, claiming a right to observe the marriage negotiations firsthand. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. Prince Julian was known throughout the three kingdoms for his ambition rather than his patience, a man who had never accepted his own kingdom's quiet agreement to leave this valley undisturbed. If he arrived now, drawn by rumors of a royal marriage taking shape in forbidden territory, his presence alone might stir exactly the kind of attention Daniel had warned against. How long until he arrives? Daniel asked. By tomorrow evening, according to the rider, Edward said. He travels with more soldiers than diplomacy usually requires. Daniel exchanged a look with Charlotte, both of them understanding the danger without needing to speak it aloud. The presence had already begun stirring in response to the marriage negotiations alone. A prince arriving with armed soldiers, drawn by ambition rather than caution, risked provoking exactly the kind of reaction that had once erased an entire village from existence. That night, the low humming sound returned, louder than before, no longer content to remain distant at the tree line. Charlotte woke near midnight to find her window rattling faintly. The temperature in her room dropped low enough that her breath became visible in the candlelight. She rose quickly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way through the darkened halls toward Daniel's study, finding him already awake, standing near the window with tense, careful stillness. "It is closer tonight," he said, without turning. Outside, past the edge of the garden, Charlotte could see a faint shifting in the darkness, a shape without solid form, moving slowly along the tree line, the way smoke moves along a ceiling, curling and stretching, without ever fully settling into one form. The humming sound rose and fell with its movement, almost musical in a way that made her skin crawl rather than soothe her. "Should we wake the guards?" she asked. "Weapons will accomplish nothing," Daniel said. "It is testing again, likely drawn by Julian's approaching soldiers as much as by our marriage. We must remain calm. Fear feeds it as much as force does." They stood together at the window, watching the shape drift slowly along the boundary of the manor grounds, never quite crossing onto the property itself, as though some old agreement still held it back, however weakly. After what felt like an hour, the shape finally retreated into the deeper trees, the humming fading gradually into the ordinary sounds of night, leaving behind a silence that felt no less unsettling than the noise it replaced. "We do not have much time," Daniel said finally. "If Julian arrives with soldiers eager to prove their courage against a threat they do not understand, it may be enough to push the presence past whatever restraint still holds it in check. Then we prepare the offering Agnes described," Charlotte said. "Before he arrives, if we can manage it." Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression torn between gratitude and old, familiar dread. "The offering must come from something I value deeply, Charlotte. I have spent years building walls around the parts of myself still capable of valuing anything at all, precisely because loss has always followed closely behind anything I allow myself to care about." Charlotte held his gaze steadily. "Then perhaps it is time to stop building walls and start deciding what you are willing to risk in order to finally be free of what has haunted you since the night you arrived." The following day passed in tense preparation. Daniel retreated often into his study, searching through old letters and fragments of memory, weighing what he might be willing to offer in exchange for an end to the bargain that had shaped every year of his life in this world. Charlotte spent the hours helping Edward reinforce the manor's defenses, not against swords or arrows, but against panic, ensuring every guard understood clearly that no weapon would help them if Julian's arrival provoked the presence into open aggression. Edward gathered the household guard in the courtyard shortly before midday, a dozen men who had served Vaith loyally for years, none of them prepared for the kind of danger this valley truly held. He spoke to them plainly, without the usual bravado of a captain rallying his men before battle. "Whatever arrives with Prince Julian's escort, you are not to draw steel against the valley's shadow," Edward said. "I know it goes against every instinct you carry as soldiers. Draw your blade against an ordinary threat, and you protect this house. Draw it against what moves in these trees, and you may only succeed in making it angrier. Your task tonight is to keep our guests calm, not to prove your courage." One of the younger guards, a soldier named Peter who had joined Charlotte's escort only the previous year, asked the question clearly troubling several of the others. "If our blades mean nothing against it, Captain, what protects us at all?" Edward considered the question honestly before answering. "Distance, patience, and the plan Daniel and the princess intend to carry out at Ashvale. Our task is simply to survive until that plan succeeds, nothing more heroic than that." The men absorbed this uneasily, but they nodded, trusting Edward's years of steady leadership even when his answers offered little comfort. Charlotte watched the exchange from the manor steps, grateful for a captain wise enough to prepare his soldiers honestly, rather than with false confidence, that might cost them dearly once night fell. By late afternoon, riders were spotted approaching the valley road, banners bearing Draymore's colors visible even from a distance. Prince Julian arrived with far more soldiers than any simple observation of marriage negotiations required, his expression carrying the confident arrogance of a man who had never personally witnessed what waited in this valley, only heard rumors he had long dismissed as superstition, meant to frighten weaker rivals. "So this is the stranger every kingdom fears," Julian said upon dismounting, looking Daniel over with open skepticism. "I expected something more impressive than an ordinary man standing in front of an ordinary house." "Appearances can be misleading, my prince," Daniel said calmly. "I would advise your soldiers to remain close to the manor grounds and avoid the tree line after dark, for their own safety." Julian laughed, the sound carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. "I did not bring soldiers across half a kingdom to hide indoors from bedtime stories, stranger. If there is truly some monster haunting these fields, perhaps it is time someone finally proved it capable of being defeated." Charlotte felt dread settle heavily in her chest, as she watched several of Julian's soldiers exchange eager, confident glances, clearly ready to prove their courage against a threat they still believed to be nothing more than exaggerated legend. She understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how quickly this arrogance might undo years of careful, fragile restraint, and exactly how little time remained before that restraint broke entirely. Night fell quickly, and with it came a change in the air that Charlotte recognized instantly from her earlier midnight vigil, a drop in temperature, a faint humming carried on the wind, growing steadily louder as full darkness settled over the valley. Several of Julian's soldiers, emboldened by wine and confidence, gathered near the tree line despite Daniel's earlier warning, torches raised, laughing among themselves as they searched for the creature they still refused to believe existed. The humming rose sharply, no longer distant, no longer patient. Charlotte watched from the manor steps as the shifting darkness she had witnessed the previous night suddenly surged forward at the tree line, faster and more solid than before, closing the distance toward the soldiers before any of them fully understood what approached. Shouts of confidence turned instantly into cries of alarm, torches scattering as the soldiers stumbled backward, the shape among them moving with a speed and purpose it had never shown before. Daniel moved immediately, running toward the chaos with Charlotte close behind, despite Edward's shouted warning for her to remain at the manor. By the time they reached the tree line, several soldiers lay scattered on the ground, not harmed, but clearly overwhelmed, their eyes wide and unfocused, murmuring incoherently about cold and silence, and a voice they could not fully describe. The shape itself had already withdrawn deeper into the trees, but its presence lingered heavily in the air, the humming now a steady, unbroken hum that showed no sign of settling back into stillness. Prince Julian arrived moments later, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by pale, shaken uncertainty, as he took in the sight of his own soldiers collapsed and disoriented at the tree line. "What?" he said slowly. "Was that?" "That," Daniel said, his voice tight with barely restrained urgency, "was a warning. The next one will not stop at a warning." Charlotte looked toward the trees, toward the darkness that had grown bolder overnight, and understood clearly that whatever time they had hoped to prepare properly had just been stripped away entirely. Whatever offering Daniel intended to make, whatever ending Agnes's old knowledge promised, it would need to happen soon, before Julian's wounded pride, or the Presence's growing hunger, decided the valley's fate for them. Inside the manor, the soldiers who had collapsed near the tree line were slowly regaining their senses, though none could describe clearly what they had experienced, only that a terrible cold had pressed into their minds, along with a sound like a voice speaking words they could almost, but never quite, understand. Julian paced the length of the main hall, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the rattled uncertainty of a man forced to accept a truth he had dismissed only hours earlier. "You knew this would happen," Julian said, rounding on Daniel. "You warned my men, and they ignored you, but you knew exactly what waited in those trees." "I have lived beside it for years," Daniel said. "I know its patterns better than anyone, though I have never claimed to control them fully." "Then control them now," Julian snapped, "before it decides my soldiers make an easier target than warnings." Charlotte stepped between them, before the tension could rise further. "Shouting at each other accomplishes nothing. What we need now is time, and a clear plan, not blame passed back and forth while the real danger grows bolder outside these walls." Daniel drew a slow breath, steadying himself before turning to address both Charlotte and Julian directly. "There may be a way to end this permanently, not merely manage it as I have managed it for years. It requires returning to Ashvale itself, where the Presence first crossed fully into this world, and completing an old exchange left unfinished since that night." Julian's expression shifted from anger to wary curiosity. "What kind of exchange?" "One that requires an offering freely given, not force or violence," Daniel said. "I do not yet know precisely how it will unfold, only that it must be attempted soon, before tonight's warning becomes tomorrow's tragedy." Julian studied Daniel for a long moment, clearly weighing pride against the memory of his soldiers collapsed and shaking at the tree line. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "My kingdom has avoided this valley for a generation out of fear alone. If there is truly a chance to end that fear permanently, I would rather see it attempted than continue pretending ignorance protects anyone. Then you will not interfere?" Charlotte asked. I will do more than that, Julian said, some of his old confidence returning, though tempered now with genuine caution rather than empty arrogance. I will send word to my father immediately, informing him of what my soldiers witnessed tonight. If this exchange truly offers a permanent end to the threat, Draymore will support the attempt rather than obstruct it. We have lost enough soldiers to unnecessary pride already. With Julian's unexpected support secured, the remainder of the night passed in urgent preparation. Edward organized a small, careful escort to accompany them toward Ashvale's ruins, while Agnes was sent for once more. Her old knowledge needed now more than ever to guide whatever ritual completion the ancient bargain required. She arrived before dawn, her expression grave but resolute, carrying a small satchel of items she claimed had belonged to her grandmother, remnants of the scholarly knowledge that had otherwise been lost to fear and fire generations earlier. The exchange must take place where the bargain first began, Agnes explained, as their small group prepared to depart. Ashvale's heart, where the old well once stood before the village emptied entirely. My grandmother believed that location still holds a thinness between worlds, a place where such offerings might finally be received properly. Daniel nodded grimly, clearly recalling memories of that place he had avoided returning to for years. I have not set foot there since the village first disappeared. I did not believe I could face it again. You will not face it alone this time, Charlotte said firmly, and something in Daniel's expression eased slightly at her words, though the weight of what awaited them remained heavy over the entire group. They rode out as the sky began to lighten, a small procession moving quietly through the valley roads toward the abandoned remains of Ashvale, Julian himself insisting on joining despite Daniel's initial hesitation, determined to witness firsthand whatever unfolded, rather than remain safely distant from a danger his own soldiers had already suffered through. The ruins of Ashvale emerged slowly from the morning mist, empty homes standing in eerie, undisturbed silence, gardens long overgrown, doors left open exactly as they had been the night the village emptied generations earlier. Nothing had been touched, nothing looted or decayed beyond simple neglect, as though time itself had paused the moment the last villager disappeared, and never quite resumed since. Charlotte felt the weight of that stillness pressing against her chest as they rode slowly through the abandoned streets toward the village center. The old well stood exactly where Agnes had described, its stones cracked and covered in moss, surrounded by a wide circle of bare earth where no plant had grown in all the years since. The humming sound Charlotte had grown familiar with over the past days rose faintly the moment their group entered the circle, though it remained distant, watchful, waiting to see what unfolded rather than surging forward immediately. This is the place, Daniel said quietly, dismounting near the well's edge. I can feel it clearly here, stronger than anywhere else in the valley. Agnes moved carefully around the circle, laying out small items from her satchel, old dried herbs and carved stones that Charlotte did not recognize, murmuring words in a language that sounded ancient and unfamiliar. The circle must remain undisturbed, she said. Whatever offering is made must happen within these bounds, freely and without hesitation, or the exchange will fail to close properly. Daniel stepped fully into the circle, his expression tight with old fear, finally being confronted directly, rather than avoided. Charlotte moved to follow him, but Agnes gently caught her arm. Only the one bound by the original bargain may stand within the circle when the offering is made, Agnes said. You may remain close, child, but you cannot make this offering for him. It must come from Daniel alone. Charlotte nodded reluctantly, stepping back to the circle's edge alongside Julian and Edward, watching as Daniel stood alone near the old well, visibly gathering the courage for whatever came next. The humming sound rose steadily now, no longer distant, curling closer around the village ruins, the way smoke curls around a dying flame, patient and hungry, and finally, after years of careful restraint, ready to test the boundary fully. I know you can hear me, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the still morning air. You gave me passage into this world, the night I was drowning in the space between. I have carried that debt for years, watching it cost more than I ever intended to pay. I am here now to finally close what was left unfinished that night. The humming shifted, deepening into something closer to a low, resonant tone that Charlotte felt as much as heard, vibrating faintly through the ground beneath her feet. The shifting darkness she had witnessed twice before began gathering at the circle's edge, taking a form more solid than she had yet seen, though still without clear shape, a presence rather than a body, ancient and patient, and utterly without warmth. Behind her, Charlotte heard Julian's breath catch sharply, his earlier confidence entirely forgotten in the face of something no soldier's training had ever prepared him to witness directly. Edward's hand rested tightly on the hilt of his sword, though he made no move to draw it, remembering his own warning to the younger guards only hours earlier. Agnes stood perfectly still beside the scattered herbs and stones, murmuring words too quiet for Charlotte to catch clearly, her weathered face calm, despite the cold now settling heavily over the entire clearing. The new grass Charlotte had noticed weeks earlier, the first true regrowth in years, seemed to shrink back from the widening circle of darkness, as though even the land itself understood this moment, demanded distance, rather than witness. A single bird, somewhere in the distant trees, called out once, and then fell silent, leaving only the low, resonant hum and the sound of Charlotte's own heartbeat pounding steadily in her ears. Daniel did not step back. Whatever fear held him rigid moments earlier seemed to steady into something closer to resolve, his shoulders squared, his offered hand perfectly still despite the trembling that had shaken it only a breath before. Charlotte realized she was gripping Edward's arm, without remembering when she had reached for it, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed entirely on the small watch resting in Daniel's open palm. "You took an entire village that night," Daniel continued, his voice steady, despite the fear Charlotte could see tightening his shoulders. "You have taken small pieces of this valley ever since, testing, waiting, hungry for something I never understood how to give you. I understand now. You did not want blood or fear. You wanted an offering equal to what you gave me, chosen freely rather than taken by force." The presence pulsed, the humming rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost like patient waiting, an audience granted rather than an attack launched. Charlotte held her breath, watching Daniel reach into his coat and withdraw a small, worn object she had not noticed him carrying before, a simple pocket watch, its surface scratched and faded with age. "This belonged to my father," Daniel said, his voice catching slightly for the first time since Charlotte had known him. "The only thing I carried with me the night you pulled me through the veil. It is the last piece I have of the life I lost, the family I never said goodbye to, the future I never got to live. I have kept it hidden away for years, unable to look at it without grief, unwilling to let it go, because it felt like losing them all over again." He held the watch out before him, his hand visibly trembling. "I offer this freely now, not because you demand it, but because I choose to finally release the grief I have carried since that night, in exchange for an ending to the debt that has cost this valley too much already." The humming surged sharply, the shifting darkness pressing closer around Daniel, close enough that Charlotte instinctively stepped forward before Edward's firm hand held her back at the circle's edge. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened, the presence simply hovering close to Daniel's offered hand, as though weighing the true value of what he presented against whatever debt it still calculated was owed. Then, slowly, the darkness reached forward, and the small watch lifted gently from Daniel's open palm, suspended for a moment in the shifting shape before it, and then it was simply gone, absorbed into the presence without sound or struggle. Daniel gasped, stumbling slightly, as though something long carried inside him had suddenly been lifted away, relief and grief crossing his features simultaneously. The humming shifted once more, deeper and slower, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived in this valley, it did not feel threatening. It felt, strangely, almost peaceful, the low tone settling into something closer to a farewell than a warning. "Is it over?" Charlotte called out, unable to hold her silence any longer. Daniel did not answer immediately, standing perfectly still as the shifting darkness around him began to thin, spreading outward from the circle, like fog dispersing beneath morning sun. The humming grew fainter with each passing moment, retreating not toward the trees this time, but simply fading into nothing, dissolving into the still morning air, until finally, after a long, breathless silence, there was nothing left at all. The dead patch of earth surrounding the old well, barren for years beyond memory, showed the first faint green shoots of new grass pushing up through the soil, as though the land itself had finally been released from a long, patient waiting. Daniel turned slowly to face them, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, "It is done," he said quietly. "I can feel it, Charlotte. For the first time since that night, I do not feel it watching anymore." Relief broke across the small group gathered at the circle's edge. Edward lowering his sword he had not even realized he was gripping tightly. Julian releasing a breath he seemed to have been holding since they first entered the ruins. Agnes moved forward slowly, examining the new growth pushing up through the barren earth with quiet, satisfied wonder. "My grandmother always believed the old bargains could be closed properly," she said softly. "I am glad to have lived long enough to see it proven true." They remained in Ashvale through the remainder of the morning, watching as small signs of life continued returning to the long-abandoned village, birds beginning to call from nearby trees, for what Charlotte realized might be the first time in years, the wind carrying ordinary sounds, rather than the low, hungry humming that had haunted the valley for so long. It felt, standing there among the quiet ruins, as though the entire land was slowly remembering how to breathe again. The ride back to the manor felt entirely different from the journey out. Where fear and tension had accompanied them toward Ashvale, something lighter now settled over the small group. Julian riding alongside Daniel with newfound respect rather than suspicion, already discussing what his father's kingdom might offer toward rebuilding the valley's reputation among the three kingdoms. News of what had happened at Ashvale spread quickly once they returned, carried first by Julian's soldiers eager to share their first-hand account, then by messengers sent onward to both Draymore and Ashcross, informing both kingdoms that the ancient threat surrounding Daniel's Valley had finally been resolved. Within days, King Alden himself arrived to witness the changed valley firsthand, his relief at seeing his daughter safe, matched only by his astonishment at the transformation already visible across the once forbidden land. He rode through the valley slowly, taking in the new grass-covering fields that had once stood gray and lifeless, the villagers of the surrounding hamlets going about ordinary business, without the careful, watchful fear that had shaped their lives for a generation. When he finally reached the manor, he found Daniel waiting near the entrance, and for a long moment, the two men simply studied one another, a king and the stranger every kingdom had once refused to acknowledge. "I sent my daughter into a valley I did not fully understand," Alden said at last. "I told myself the risk was worth the chance at peace, though I confess, I feared I had made a terrible mistake the moment her carriage passed beyond the stone markers." "You were not wrong to fear it," Daniel said honestly. "I would not have blamed you for refusing the arrangement entirely." Alden studied him a moment longer, then extended his hand, an unmistakable gesture of respect rather than mere political necessity. "Whatever burden you carried alone for so many years, you have carried it in a way that protected far more people than it ever harmed. My daughter wrote to me of your courage at Ashvale. I see now she did not exaggerate." Daniel accepted the king's hand, something easing visibly in his posture, years of guarded distance finally beginning to soften into something closer to belonging. Charlotte, watching from a nearby window, felt her own relief settle deeply, knowing that whatever challenges still lay ahead for the three kingdoms, this particular fear, at least, had finally been laid to rest. The marriage that had originally been arranged out of desperate political necessity took place several weeks later, though it bore little resemblance to the tense, uncertain arrangement Charlotte had first traveled toward months earlier. Representatives from all three kingdoms attended, Julian himself standing among the honored guests, a symbol of how quickly fear could give way to genuine alliance, once its true cause had finally been understood and resolved. Charlotte stood beside Daniel in the manor's newly restored garden, flowers blooming freely for the first time in years, across soil that had once refused to grow anything at all. Grace moved among the gathered guests with genuine warmth rather than practiced caution. Edward stood at ease rather than watchful tension, and Agnes herself had been given a place of honor among the ceremony's witnesses, her grandmother's old knowledge finally recognized rather than dismissed as superstition. "I did not expect to find peace this way," Daniel said quietly to Charlotte, as the ceremony drew to its close, the three kingdoms' representatives finally speaking openly with one another, rather than trading fearful glances across a valley they had avoided for a generation. "Neither did I," Charlotte admitted. "But perhaps the peace that lasts longest is the kind built on understanding rather than avoidance." Daniel took her hand, and for the first time since she had arrived in this valley, she saw him smile, without the weight of old grief shadowing it. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we will face it together, rather than each carrying our burdens alone. Nearby, Edward stood with Peter and the rest of the household guard, watching the ceremony with quiet satisfaction, rather than the wary vigilance that had defined their first days in the valley. Never thought I would see the day. Soldiers from 3 kingdoms stood together at this manor, without swords drawn, Edward remarked. Peter nodded, still faintly amazed by everything he had witnessed since that first frightened night at the tree line. My grandchildren will not believe this story when I tell it, Captain. Tell it anyway, Edward said. Some stories deserve to outlive their doubters. Grace moved among the guests, offering refreshments with an ease she had never shown during Charlotte's early days at the manor, pausing occasionally to exchange warm words with villagers who had once avoided the manor entirely out of long habit, rather than any recent danger. Oliver stood near the garden's edge, watching new flowers bloom in soil that had refused to grow anything at all only weeks earlier, a small, satisfied smile settling over his weathered face. Julian himself raised a toast before the gathered guests, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by genuine respect. To the valley, every kingdom once feared, he said, and to the courage it took to finally understand, rather than avoid it. The guests raised their cups together, representatives from Vaith, Draymore, and Ashcross, standing shoulder to shoulder, for the first time in living memory, the old rivalries and fears that had divided them for a generation, finally beginning to soften into something resembling genuine alliance. The valley that once stood empty between 3 warring kingdoms, marked only by fear and stone boundary markers no soldier dared cross, slowly became known instead as a place of quiet renewal. Its story carried from village to village, kingdom to kingdom, not as a warning to be avoided, but as proof that even the oldest, most terrifying burdens could finally be set down, when faced honestly, rather than hidden away in silence. And so, where fear had once ruled every conversation about the stranger and his valley, peace finally took root instead, growing steadily alongside the new grass covering Ashvale's long empty fields, a peace built not on the absence of danger, but on the courage it took to finally face it, together, until nothing remained to fear at all.